Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is Hans von Spakovsky. He's a former member of the Federal Election Commission and is manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. He also served on President Trump's Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. With coronavirus either postponing or causing a lot of concern in primaries this year, many activists are urging the nation, as well as the states, to be prepared to hold much of this year's elections, possibly even the November general elections, by mostly mail-in ballots. President Trump has said in recent days that he's resistant to that idea because of the opportunity for fraud being greater in voting by mail. So what are the facts and what should be done in these unique circumstances? That's what we'll discuss now. And Hans, thanks so much for being with us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Well, the push is on. I'm sure you've seen it from federal lawmakers. Elizabeth Warren's making a big deal of this. Officials around the country, that this needs to happen. Some have even said in this information age, why do we even have in-person voting anymore? But when it comes to the risk of people possibly catching coronavirus or something else, if they have to stand in line for a while to vote, this mail-in option has to be widely available for folks across the country. So what's your reaction to this push?
My reaction to this push is that it's an overreaction. Now, it's obvious that we're in the midst of this coronavirus right now, and people are being ordered to stay home and not going to work. So for primaries coming up immediately, yeah, there may be a need to conduct those by mail, but there are ways to do that and ways not to do it. But the idea that we'll need an all-mail election in November, which is a long way away, particularly given that all of the different models, including the best case and worst case scenarios, have this epidemic cresting some point this summer, long before the election. Obviously, we may all be back to work, all be back at school in November, and therefore back in the polling places. For states that do have to conduct an election by mail through absentee ballots, there are things they should be doing to do that. And as I said, there are things they should not be doing that could imperil the security of the election process. Why? Well, because absentee ballots are voted outside the supervision of election officials. They're the easiest ballots to cheat with and, frankly, to intimidate voters because there are no election officials present to prevent that from happening.
So you did my job for me, Hans. I really appreciate that. You said there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. So walk us through both.
Sure. Well, for example, Nancy Pelosi's coronavirus bill, which didn't pass Congress, thank goodness, had a provision in it that said that states would be forced to automatically mail an absentee ballot to every registered voter in their state. Well, the problem with that is that voter rolls are in terrible condition all over the country because states, particularly places like California, aren't doing a good job of cleaning up their rolls. And what I mean by that is taking off people who are registered more than once, taking off people who have died and shouldn't be on the list anymore, taking off people who have moved out of state and shouldn't be on there anymore. If you simply mail out an absentee ballot to every single voter, there will be literally tens of thousands, in some states, hundreds of thousands of ballots arriving at the residences of voters who are no longer there. And the temptation, the opportunity will be there for those ballots to get voted, for vote harvesters, candidates, campaigns, and others try to collect those ballots and vote them. That's the wrong way to do it. The better way to do this, if you have to have an all-mail election, is election officials should mail out an absentee ballot request form to all voters. That's a form the voter will have to complete, sign, and mail back in order to get an absentee ballot. Those envelopes, when they show up at people's homes, the request for an absentee ballot, if the U.S. Postal Service shows that that person doesn't live there anymore, they will be returned to election officials. So election officials will actually get notice that a particular registered voter shouldn't be registered anymore.
So one of the other things that we've seen controversy over, Hans, and you and I have talked about it, is ballot harvesting.
Yes.
California recently put it in place, and some folks believe that it made a big difference in some of the congressional races. And it basically liberalizes who can return a ballot. It's not just the voter themselves or a close family member. could literally be anyone dropping it back off. And that obviously creates some concerns. The argument on the other side, of course, is it should be as easy as possible for people to vote, not harder. So what is the proper protocol in your estimation for who ought to be able to handle these ballots if, in fact, we end up going down this road?
Vote harvesting is a very unwise policy. And here's what people need to know. Look, in every state, you can vote by absentee ballot. And you then have the ability to either mail it back, which obviously is what we should be doing if social distancing is still the norm, or you can hand deliver it yourself to election officials, or in almost every state, a member of your family can hand deliver it. States that have legalized vote harvesting allow anyone to pick up your ballot. That is a bad idea because that means that candidates, campaign organizations, party activists, political guns for hire can all show up to your house to pick up your ballot and to pressure or intimidate you into voting a particular way. These are people, all of whom have a stake in the outcome of the election, and putting something as valuable as a ballot in their hands is a bad idea. Absentee ballot fraud does occur, and that includes through the vote harvesting or vote collection business. We have cases like that that were prosecuted and people were convicted for forging, altering absentee ballots they collected from people's home. Those are all in our election fraud database at the Heritage Foundation.
What's your sense of the scope of this? Obviously, it could be happening on a level we're not familiar with, but I know, like you just said, that you document this at the Heritage Foundation, but a lot of folks are going to be saying, on the one side, that this would have to be going on a massive scale, and surely we'd know about it if it were to actually make a difference, particularly in a presidential race, but even most statewide races. And others, as I've talked to in the past, perhaps you included, have said, well, in 2,537 votes in a really big state made a difference. So what's your sense on how much the concerns over mail balloting would actually have on the outcomes?
Well, the more absentee balloting there is, the greater the chances of fraud. And it doesn't take a lot of fraud to change the outcomes of many elections because we have close elections all the time around the country. And the thing that I think people don't realize is this is extremely hard to detect. And to give you an example of that, we're about to add a case to our voter fraud database of a man who, to show how vulnerable the system is, was convicted out in California of registering his 4 dogs to vote. Now, the only reason election officials knew about it was because he told them he had done it. They did not detect it. If he had not said anything, he could have easily requested absentee ballots for those 4 dogs, and he could have voted those ballots. And again, election officials would not have been able to detect it. That's the problem with absentee ballot fraud. It's extremely hard to know that it's happening.
So as this debate goes on, Hans, on the one hand, you have President Trump and perhaps others, mainly on the right, who want to make sure that the election is as honest as possible. And then the argument from mostly Democrats is we want to make sure that everyone can vote. And to not be moving in this direction is an effort to suppress the vote.
Yeah, the problem with that argument is that it's very clear that's not, in fact, what they are doing. Because as I've said, every single state allows individuals to vote by absentee ballot. There is no need for congressional legislation like the ones that, the things that Nancy Pelosi was pushing in her coronavirus bill. The only thing her bill did was to try to get rid of security precautions that states have put in the handling and processing of absentee ballots. And that is the worst thing that could happen.
Well, we'll certainly be watching. I'm guessing the debate's going to go on for quite a while here, especially as we get into what was supposed to be convention season. We'll see if we even have those. But as we get closer to the November elections, Hans, thank you very much, as always, for your insights and your expertise.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Hans von Spakovsky is a former member of the Federal Election Commission, a manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation, and he also served on President Trump's Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.